Hi, my name is Dr. M. Satish Kumar. I'm in the Department of Geography, Archaeology and Paleoecology in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University, Belfast. I've been here for almost 24 years. I worked and supported the university at all levels. Currently, I am the academic lead for EDI and also a co-chair for Swan Athena at the School of Natural and Built Environment. I have worked, as I said, in the original documentation with Tracy Galvin and Advanced HE on EDI, preparing a report for Queen's. So today's talk is about EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusivity, why it matters. Most people talk about EDI and they pay homage to it, but very few know how to engage with the questions of EDI. So I want to start by providing you with a context regarding EDI and why it matters for any institution, whether it's Queen's or any higher education institution, and across the private and the public sector. So in terms of the context, I want to draw your attention to an article which came out in Nature in 2022 by Gibney, which states that data has shown that the representation of scientists from marginalised ethnicities dwindles at each stage of UK academia. And this is quite significant, that when we look at the data, hard data, granular data, it tells us that the representations of scientists from marginalised communities literally dwindles at each stage in their career in the academia. Black people make up 4% of UK's working age population and 8% of its science undergraduates, yet they make up only 0.6% of the science professors. In all academic fields, just 160 of the UK's 22,855 professors are black and just 1/4 are women. In terms of Asian, mixed or multiple ethnic groups, according to HESA, other ethnicities also dwindle with seniority, especially if you are located in a science faculty. So why EDI matters? These figures show not only the injustice, but also the way the UK's science and QUB is impoverished by losing diversity of thought and experience. So QUB is particularly notorious in this respect, with the white male-female privilege calling the shots. The question is, why are science environments and structures so inhospitable for some academics of color in this hallowed institution? Where is fairness in this one university system? The proportion of minority ethnic communities in the professoriate and senior management roles has barely shifted from 0.5 to 0.6%. Progression up the seniority ladder relies on opaque, randomized factors such as social networks being vouched by another academic within the institution, as well as access to information on grants. Even mentoring is used as a cop-out option, and studies have shown that senior professors tend to guide people who are similar to themselves, an effect sometimes termed as affinity bias. It's like navigating from one side of a cluttered room to another. Some are given a torch and others are not. You can't blame people for shining a torch to help someone out. But if you're not being helped as much as selective others, it's going to make a difference in progression. Members of marginalised communities have a hard time progressing and face extreme forms of microaggression from seniors and peers alike. And these include questioning their credibility. A good example is senior management in schools and faculties. Students' SET and SEM scores show biases against minority ethnic teachers. Finally, researchers of color feel that they have to do more to demonstrate their ability and skills than white colleagues. This is backed by wider studies such as the McGregor-Smith Review of 2017. Therefore, the lack of diversity promotes inequality in QUB. Colored applicants applying PI in UCRI grants success rate is 13% compared to white academics of 30%. Says Mokia, a Kenyan in his 15 years as a professor, has had all of his UCRI applications turned down once every 18 months. I'm very close to that figure as well in the last 24 years. What hampers diversity in higher education institutions is widespread structural issues which amount to systemic forms of racism, about which institutions are very much in denial. There needs to be an acceptance that not everybody is being given the opportunity to flourish and to do as well as they can. Some faculty and schools in the university are notorious in this regard. There is a systemic bias in terms of support unless you belong to a group. See, the outline of the talk, I want to present the outline of the talk for you. It looks quite lengthy, but I will start with this quotation in 1676 in a letter to his fellow scientist, Robert Hooke, who is a theologian. Isaac Newton wrote, "If I have seen a little further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Newton's letter to a theologian and author, John of Salisbury, writing in 1159, used a version of the phrase, going on to say, "We see more and things that are more distant than they did, not because our sight is superior or because we are taller than they, but because they raise us up and by their great stature add to ours." This metaphor acknowledges that advancement in thinking and practice often comes from the inspiration, provocation, and challenge that encountering the ideas of others. Giants are those from whom we can learn and springboard our own learning and process. When we think about the influences on the canon of equity, diversity, and inclusion today, several significant questions come to mind. Who are our giants? What is our framework of reference for recognizing them? How do we challenge exclusionary notions of scholarship, evidence, and expertise, and acknowledge and value the work of scholars and practitioners from marginalized groups? How do we ensure that we are learning from the widest diversity of sources, resources, lived experience, and location? How do we encounter ideas that challenge our own ideas in a way that maximizes the potential for learning? How do we ensure diversity among future giants in the way we encourage, support, value, and promote our students and staff? How can co-creation and collaboration with students, staff, and other communities enhance our understanding of EDI? What can we learn from EDI thinking and practice in sectors other than higher education? So what is EDI? Equality, diversity, and inclusion ensures fair treatment and opportunity for all. It aims to eradicate prejudice and discrimination on the basis of an individual or a group of individuals' protected characteristics. EDI, as inscribed by the Advanced HE policy document, is very different from EDI as performed by the institutions. So let me take each of them and try and explain that further. Equality. This means everyone is given equal opportunities regardless of their background, abilities, or lifestyle. So equality really means fairness. We must ensure that individuals or group of individuals are not treated less favorably because of their protected characteristics. Equality also means equality of opportunity. We must also ensure that those who may be disadvantaged can get the tools they need to access the same fair opportunities as their peers. In sum, equality means making sure that everyone is treated fairly and with dignity and respect. It means challenging discrimination and removing barriers so that everyone has an opportunity to achieve their desired outcomes. The second is diversity. Diversity is recognizing, respecting, and celebrating each other's differences. Diversity and inclusion are two interconnected concepts, and I think we need to be very much aware that they are not interchangeable. Diversity is about representation or the makeup of an entity. In sum, diversity is about recognizing the benefits of different values, abilities, and perspectives, and celebrating people's differences. This means promoting an environment that welcomes and values diverse backgrounds, thinking, skills, and experience. I recall when I was a couple of years ago, there was a call out for the Ulster Museum to produce a poster, a public poster, and had colleagues calling me up from the minority ethnic communities to say, should I send my child for that photographic session? Because all other posters since then, at that point of time, had photographs which was white only. And given the diversity of visitors to the Ulster Museum, they wanted to capture that. But I don't think they got it right at that time. It took a long time for them to make that change. So yes, diversity is important to recognize, but to implement the principles of diversity is far more important. The third element is inclusion. Inclusion is about how well the contributions, presence, and perspectives of different groups of people are valued and integrated into an environment. So this idea of valuation and integration becomes really critical when you talk about inclusivity. Inclusion means creating an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued. An inclusive environment can only be created once we are more aware of our unconscious bias and have learned how to manage them. In sum, inclusion is providing a space where everyone has equal access to opportunities and resources, where everyone feels valued and accepted. Everyone should be able to contribute and have a voice. This may mean making reasonable adjustments to facilitate participation. So what steps are we taking in this university providing reasonable support to every individual from the colored and minority ethnic communities? That is a key question, and it is not easy. So inclusion can only happen when things are transparent. Most of the time, because of the existing rules and regulations, and most times transparency becomes the biggest casualty when we promote inequality, when we promote independent ad hoc decision-making process. So I want to take this next slide. So promoting equality, diversity and inclusion in the university and in the classrooms help to ensure that each student or staff is able to learn in an environment where all aspects of their identities are recognized, respected, and where they feel safe and secure to contribute. So the next section I want to talk about, what does EDI mean for the discipline? What does EDI mean for the institution? Now, these are two elements which together informs how EDI should be managed. How do we inform, nurture, and develop a racially diverse staff and postgraduate research community at Queen's? How do we assess the attainment of an international staff and the cohort of international students? That's a big question. Tackling inequalities on the grounds of race, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. That is very important. We cannot afford to shy away from the need to think and work intersectionally to effect structural change. Learning across differences. That's the first key point. For example, approaches to fostering good relations and supporting respectful dialogue around contentious issues. Ideas for developing whole institutional engagements on EDI. These are very important elements. Learning across the globe. Sharing insights and expertise that widen our understanding of EDI across the world. For example, indigenous scholarships, the ways of learning, models of effective international collaboration and exchanges. Third, learning from students, including innovative practice in curriculum design, co-creation, and collaboration. Students' engagement strategies are really, really important. A student-led approaches to dignity and respect, mental health and well-being, working with student governors and representatives. The fourth element is learning from beyond the higher education sector. Examples of innovative practice from outside the sector, in the private sector, in the corporate sector, are really important in our endeavor to manage and endeavor to integrate EDI into everything we do. Developing giants, the fifth question, ideas for encouraging and supporting development of diverse community of experts, scholars, leaders, and practitioners For example, early career researchers development and positive action programs. Creating giants out of these minority ethnic communities is crucial. On the shoulders of these giants, sharing innovative thinking, research that widens knowledge and understanding of any aspect of EDI. There's an opportunity to be giants. How can QB create equitable and inclusive spaces to meet the demands of EDI? Professor Stephen Covey famously said, "Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with an intent to reply." Invariably, we find people do not listen and spend more time trying to reply to a question. So EDI is really about us trying to listen, to understand before we open our mouth to respond because we think we have the answers to it. I think the key challenge is a behavioral change in the way we respond to people with different viewpoints, different perspectives, giving them a chance to speak, giving them a chance to contribute. And we may agree or we may not agree, but we have to listen. Listen to understand rather than listen to reply. How to make teaching, research, and administration practices inclusive and engaging across different protected characteristics. So I want to take a few minutes here now to talk about areas where EDI matters for interventions. And what are these protective characteristics? We know it, but I think it's important to reiterate those protected characteristics. Number one, disabilities. Number two, gender. Number three, religion, ethnicities, race, language, age, and job category. So these are protective characteristics. So no matter what we do, we need to ensure that these protective categories are always there. So looking at the critical themes, why are my individual perceptions of institutionalized practices in my discipline we need to question? And that is crucial. Why do we need to question those protective characteristics in our discipline? What constitutes valuable knowledge and practices? How do we deal with bias, either conscious or unconscious? How does it relate to our perception and our own expectations? Ideas for instigating pedagogical change. Improve colonial and decolonial and post-colonial literacy. Improve racial literacy. And this applies to all disciplines. Improve gender literacy. How do you improve gender literacy? Just not by reading about gender, but you can also improve gender literacy in sciences. You can improve gender literacy in social sciences, in humanities, right across the board. It depends on how you are able to provide examples, case studies, using categories which are necessarily people covering those gender characteristics and BME characteristics. Improving BME literacy, understanding what BME stands for, or minority ethnic community literacy. Improving disability literacy. I think majority of us in this profession doesn't realize the whole spectrum of disability. And even when we are dealing with students, we tend to normalize disability because there are so many categories and characteristics of disability that we don't take account of. And being mindful about disability literacy is absolutely central to EDI. Improving ageism and providing improving ageism literacy again is really crucial. These are areas of unconscious bias that creeps in as a result of the fact that we do not have confidence in understanding those ideas and concepts, and we lack the literacy. So institutions should be providing more and more to improve the literacy, especially when you have international staff. How far are you in a position to provide that literacy across the board, and also to reiterate to those who have been here for a long time to understand the significance of these literacy, these forms of literacy. So partnership with staff and students, empower minoritized voices, encourage openness and participation, and learn from diverse perspectives in working to deliver the university's ambition and mandate to become an anti-racist and inclusive institution. Academic excellence is a polymorphous term, and yet it's very commonly applied with a profile and a set of outcomes in mind when we're looking at progressions, when we're looking at appointing people into various committees. Facilitating students' sense of belonging, ensuring equity of experience so all students have an opportunity to thrive, and make sure all students feel valued and are at the heart of the strategic vision. If you were to look at the whole perspective, especially in terms of ensuring the inclusivity for all staff and students going forward, we have to look at our classrooms, we have to look at our labs, we have to look at the examples we use in the classrooms. Where do we draw these examples from? What sort of examples do we pick? Are they examples which are very provincial? Are they examples which are very global? Are they examples which are very national? And I think we need to be very mindful about the opportunity to bring everyone together. I make it a point when I'm teaching. I remember many years ago when I was doing introduction to statistics and econometrics, because my first degree is in economics, I had the opportunity to introduce statistics based on standard procedures. But I decided I will use examples from the real world, and I have now since then adapted using materials from the discipline that I'm teaching. If I'm addressing students in geography, I bring in examples, case examples from geography, from the field of geography, or from the field of history or post-colonial studies. So it is important, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a data scientist, what sort of materials are you using to communicate to a cohort of students who are also a minority in the class, but they have a valuable role to play in enhancing the learning experience for both the staff and the students. So the next question that I'm asked is, what are my EDI practices in each module and why are they important? Sharing difficult pedagogical moments faced by lecturers and the discomforting pedagogies experienced by some students. So this is a big area of interest which I want to discuss a bit, because of the fact that when we look at the pedagogical moments in our time, sharing difficult pedagogical moments and trying to say how do we address these issues and why does it happen? Because there's a big contradiction between what you're talking in the classroom in terms of theories and established notions and pedagogies and what the real life experience of the students are. Okay, so we don't try to bridge that gap, and it's hugely problematic because students come, they're far well versed with ideas and what's happening in the immediate surroundings, and we come up with an established notion of ideas of how this module should be taught. And I think that is the point when we have difficult pedagogical moments and trying to deal with. Let me give you an example. When I started my first lecture in Queen's, having come from Cambridge, where diversity was not an issue at all because everyone is diverse there from staff to students, coming into Queen's and giving my first lecture in 2000 and trying to address a group of 30 students in the classroom. I was teaching a course on spaces of urbanization. The first lecture I gave, I asked this question right in the outset: how many of you have traveled to cities outside of Belfast into the developing world? Out of a class of 30, I had 3 hands which went up very silently, very quietly, very shyly. I never asked this question again. Today, if I were to ask the same question, I think almost 99.9% hands would go up. But those were early days coming out of the Good Friday Agreement, trying to find a foothold in this educational system, providing that freedom for them to explore. So that was a difficult pedagogical movement, because that's what I would start with. How many have been to Germany? How many have been to Frankfurt? How many have been to Berlin? So that I can talk about the whole genre of music and how Wagner's music and how it influenced the growth of the city. That's what I would do in an institution like Cambridge. But here I would not be able to ask that question. How many have been seen these shanty towns in Mumbai? So these pedagogical moments are really critical, and to be mindful about the fact that sometimes those students may not necessarily know what has happened. It's the same when I was teaching in India. I had many of my students who would come in an empty stomach because they did not have the means to pay for a breakfast to come to the classroom. But recognizing that people are coming with difficult situations, to be able to be empathetic to those students and to be mindful that not everyone is hitting the ground running. We have to take them along. Tensions arise when our theoretical explanations for inequalities and power differentials clash with students' existing knowledge of the social world. This is crucial. This is absolutely important to understand. How do we bridge that gap? And as academics, as teachers, as educators, we have a responsibility to bridge that gap between the theoretical and the pragmatic, the actual and the observed. Okay? So I'm going to use examples from my modules that I teach, GGY 1012, which is on on development, which is looking at human geography, economy, society, population studies. GGY 3063, which looks at spaces of urbanization in emerging economies, and GGY 7001, which is a master's program looking at geopolitics and looking at the whole issues of sovereignty and state. So, looking at pedagogical design, let me take a few minutes to go through a few elements. I'm not going to go into great detail. I will position the EDI SDG within the range of modules taught in geography in the 3 years of undergraduate program and of the master's offered in the School of Natural and Built Environment. So looking at my own approach to EDI and trying to embed that within the context of post-colonial theory, I always ask the questions about post-colonial theory and universalisms. Post-colonial theory reminds us there's something important at stake in universalization. It's very easy to universalize a particular situation, normalize a particular event. But for me, as a critical educator, I have to be mindful that universalisms do not necessarily answer the questions that the student expect to be answered. It is this claim of universalization, a key trope of liberal historiography, that I am challenging in my modules. Why ideas from the subalterns in the global south matter. Challenging this form of liberal historiography is crucial to advancing EDI in the curriculum. As Roy states, a Eurocentric diet helps to misread historical and civilizational differences as empirical variations. This is not about getting the empirical story right. The role of embedding EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusivity in our curriculum demands mindfulness, demands awareness about the students and about the type of students, the group of students who come from different parts of Belfast, comes from different parts of Northern Ireland, comes from different parts of the United Kingdom, but also comes from different parts of the world, whether it's from Ghana, whether it's from India or South Africa. For long, our scholarship has remained circumscribed by master narratives from the global north as a product of the European Enlightenment. The consequence is a lack of appreciation of counter-narratives which emanate from the developing world. Education and its pedagogical design of preparation, revelation, and transmission provide the framework for embedding EDI in the curriculum and thereby meeting the mandate of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in higher education. The focus for me is on providing cognitive justice in the modules engaged across the spectrum of undergraduate, postgraduate curriculum, which in a way reiterates the first principles of the Undercommons agenda. And I want to take a few minutes here to talk about the significance of cognitive justice, because that cognitive justice is critical to bridge the gap between students' perceptions of the real world and our classroom teaching, where our classroom teaching derives its resources and materials from things which have been established in the 1800s and 1900s. So there's a big gap. The pedagogical gap is crucial. So the first principle of Undercommons agenda is that when seeking to make things better, one is not just doing it for the other, but also for oneself too. And this Undercommons principle underscores, underwrites everything I do in terms of my teaching for the last 32 years. So looking at the provincializing geographical knowledge, post-colonial scholarship demands a need for reworking, exploring, or provincializing European thought and practices based on knowledge, experience, and produced from the margins of the former colonial empire. In my modules, I attempt to bring together the experience of the dispossessed and those marginalized from the global south. This helps to reinforce not just limits to academic knowledge production and responsibilities, but also to interrogate the ethics and politics of differences between the global south and between the global north and the south. The domain of learning calls for contextualization and co-production of representations from the developing world and the margins. Such a domain of learning is in constant flux without necessarily slipping into the rhetoric of abstractions and distancing. This is possible only by avoiding the romanticization of knowledge as an epitome of European Enlightenment, which also created the brutality of imperialism, of colonialism, the Holocaust, and the two world wars and the countless other conflicts. Here, questioning the very theoretical and analytical concepts which frame Western and international scholarship is a way forward. In all of my research-led teaching modules, I have endeavored to provide a post-colonial, decolonial critique of established knowledge systems. The resources I garnered are drawn from a wide variety of sites, in particular from the Global South, and relatable to local and global contexts. So for my students, what I do is, in terms of my lectures in the classroom, I make sure that the connect between the global, the national, the local, the regional are absolutely there in every lecture that I give in my classroom at Queen's. And so that students from Northern Ireland gets a perspective and gets a nuanced perspective of the Global South, and also gets a perspective in terms of their own position, in terms of their own positionality, where they're located, whether they're in East or West or North or South Belfast or in Strabane or Omagh. So Europe, therefore, is no longer a silent referent to my pedagogy. Existing pedagogy and curriculum in geography are based on relative and at times absolute ignorance of non-Western histories and geographies. Surprisingly, this does not seem to affect the quality of their work being published in so-called quality journals without meaningful and relatable content. And we get our students to read those same materials. So obviously, the perspectives that they have are very much limited to the perspectives promoted and advanced in the global North. When I was a student studying in India, doing my PhD and master's program, we had the good fortune to access materials from the United States, access materials from Europe and the United Kingdom. So we find that sometimes we spend more time promoting our own friends in the academia, reading their works, which may not necessarily be path-breaking and be critical, in lieu of those more critical literature, which demands more work for us, more work for the students to get their head around it. And that is a big challenge when we come to embedding EDI within the curriculum. So universalization of knowledge needs to be challenged. This is the focus of my work at Queen's. So post-colonial knowledge is all about provincializing universal knowledge by drawing upon ideas from Asia, from India, from South Africa, etc. Finding a new register within which to frame theory is the challenge. So my modules help to challenge the provincial nature of hegemonic knowledge that emanates from the Anglo-Saxon world. Decolonizing knowledge means going beyond or shaking off the colonial frame of reference, of thinking. Education is not just about impartation of information, but also a method of thinking analytically and perceiving ourselves as holistically as possible as individuals. Challenging the long trap of exceptionalism, so clearly expressed by Mamdani, by tracing the long paths of these debates on knowledge, the colony, and decolonization, and examine critically the prospects for change. So for me, when I look at this whole debate about cognitive justice, when I look about the questions, long trap of exceptionalism, how do I challenge it? In every discipline, we have to go back to understanding the significance of the history of that idea. Where did that idea come from? What new changes and concepts were introduced over a period of time, whether it's in crystal chemistry, whether it's in geography or history. How to ensure cognitive justice, prescribed and performed cognitive justice in the context of EDI. How cognitive justice is prescribed and performed through inclusive learning environment. How is EDI prescribed and performed through an inclusive learning environment? EDI calls for cognitive justice by bringing to the fore ideas which promote diversity, which promotes equality and inclusivity. Intentionality, premeditated and normalized interpretations. I argue that doing cognitive justice requires new arrangements between the researchers and the researched, which also brings with it ethical and methodological considerations. According to Shiv Vishwanathan, the principles of cognitive justice are it strengthens the voice of the defeated and the marginalized. Traditional knowledge and technology should not be museumized, and every citizen is a scientist, every layperson is an expert. Themes that animate my pedagogy are unevenness of global development, unfreedom where there is lack of liberty, lack of civil rights, lack of political rights creates underdevelopment, questions of social justice, questions of equality, questions of transparency, and about common experiences. So for me, when I look at these issues, the themes that animate my pedagogy and pedagogical approaches to my discipline, I realize that having been an interdisciplinary scholar and having written and researched in the fields of history, economics, and geography, and other disciplines as well, that we need to be absolutely clear why we are doing what we are doing in terms of our identity as an academic, as a researcher, as a person, as an educator. So these principles of unfreedom, equality, justice, transparency are really crucial. So I'll give you an example. Working on a historical piece looking at the issues of infanticide in colonial India and in Asia, and then trying to understand that infanticide is only one aspect of history because it affected almost all cultures in the global north as well, even though it was made as an exception in the context of global south. So, how do you redress, how do you change that narrative? How do you transform that narrative to say it has been a common feature of infanticide, of child sacrifices across many cultures. It's not a preserve of the global south. Okay, so just giving you an idea that areas where you can really transform the way you do things. Embedding EDI and SDG is crucial in the curriculum. So in my lectures, I introduce students to the right to the city, the role of neoliberal urbanism in influencing and instigating change in the urban fabric is not usually beneficial. So in the right to the city, I want to take a few minutes here to talk about the issues about the right to the city. In one of the lectures in early 2000s, when I went to the lecture hall to give this talk on the right to the city, in the night before, the riots in Ardoin had happened. We had students from both the communities sitting in the classroom. And I had come prepared for a lecture on the right to the city. And my students engaged in the 2 hours lecture, discussing, debating the debates, questions about the right to the city as citizens of the city, without necessarily drawing issues or sectarian ideas into the classroom. They were most engaged in terms of how to improve the right to the city for all communities in their own respective areas. So that was one of the most incredible experience for me, one of the most enlightening experience for me to see students, the youth who has the future of this country, discussing passionately about improving the right to the city. And I think for me, that was the most transformative moment as an educator in Queen's University. The second area is on gender and development, about unevenness, about inequality, disparity across gender groups, which are highlighted, in particular the role of patriarchal ideology, which dominates all discourses. And again, I'm deeply invested in the questions of gender and development, about indigeneity and post-colonialism. These are issues, these are areas which are absolutely central to who we are as a human being, as part of this planet Earth, as part of this Anthropocene planet. So really looking at issues of indigeneity and post-colonialism are critical. Internationalism and post-colonialism, again, recalibration of the post-colonial optics, calls for productive engagement with diverse post-colonial thoughts and theories. These range from literary criticisms to theological interpretations. Of interest here is the way post-colonial ideas have been incorporated by social scientists and humanities in the reconstruction of spatiality, and subjectivity is really of great interest. This challenges ideas of imperialism with all its nuanced connotations. So there is what I call an ethical and moral issue when we come to EDI. My question is, can ethical and moral principles serve as a basis for reconstructing a harmonious, poverty-free, non-violent, self-sufficient society? So coming to the conclusion, and I want to draw some of the key questions and key ideas that I've been speaking till now, and also provide some specific recommendations for Queen's to understand how EDI can really become a mandate for the university going forward into the 21st century, into a global university. Cognitive justice demands a recognition of knowledge. Knowledge not from any one place, from all places. Not only as a method, but as a way of life. And on this point, my findings make a connection. Thus, knowledge and participation in the making of this knowledge is key to embedding EDI in our curriculum. An understanding of cognitive justice is that goes beyond recognition of diverse knowledge alone and promotes social justice as embodied by the Sustainable Development Goals. Whose knowledge counts? Unconscious bias occurs when people favor others who are similar to them. For instance, those who look like them or share their values and beliefs. Unconscious bias is a consequence of a human brain using shortcuts to speed up decision making. And we have been there. We've always been there when we are making decisions. When you're running out of time, when you have a child care, when you have other cares, when you pick up responsibilities, and we make shortcuts. And that's when unconscious bias pours over, literally floods over our objective mind. Our biases are influenced by our background, our cultural environment, and our own experiences. So when does EDI matter? Where there is persistent unconscious bias. So when we say EDI in the context of university, when does it matter? When there is persistent unconscious bias. Removing persistent unconscious bias is the only way you can advance the principles of EDI in any university, and especially Queen's. Unconscious bias is most likely to occur when individuals are under pressure. And this particular part of the talk is picked up from the EDI mandate of AHRC. Research councils use this. It occurs when individuals are under pressure, have a high cognitive load, need to reach a closure because of time constraint, are tired or hungry, depleted by low blood sugar, and resort to overall impressions to ensure that the process creates the right conditions to maximize fairness and objectivity and minimize the likelihood of unconscious bias affecting decisions. There is an express need to ensure. So here is a big issue. How can we embed EDI across the university, across the faculties, across the schools, across the disciplines? That's the biggest challenge Queen's has. It's no point having EDI at a university level, but does not get translated, rolled over across the faculties, across the schools, across the disciplines within the schools, across the professional and support staff systems, right across the board. In fact, Canada is one country which has really gone full blast to make sure that EDI is incorporated into everything they do. Even every conferences they go, they start by introducing those principles of EDI. So EDI means to enforce diversity in order to ensure that a wide range of views is represented within the constraints of ensuring that a committee in QB has the necessary expertise. Attention should be paid to ensuring gender balance, ethnic diversity, geographic diversity, institutional diversity, and diversity of career stages. Chairs of the committee need to read the implementation intention statement in every progression meeting, in every subcommittees of progression, in every subcommittees in the appointment committees at the beginning of each meeting to set the tone for discussions. I use this example from UCRI. The statement reads as follows, and this is done for every AHRC panel meeting. It is our intention to ensure that the panel's deliberation today is fair and equitable, and we will achieve this through paying close attention to the scoring criteria and definitions and by challenging any imprecise language used by panel members which might allow unconscious biases to creep into the panel's discussions. Conflict of interests are carefully managed. Members must not introduce proposals if they have known conflict of interest and must leave the room in virtual meetings for the discussion of proposal if they have a conflict of interest. EDI means that those in positions of responsibility, i.e. pro-vice chancellors, deans, head of schools, directors of research, directors of education, program directors, should be mindful of the potential biases and are quick to challenge imprecise language, particularly where members refer to feelings and impressions, especially during progressions and selections and disciplinary committee meetings and tribunals. Other members must also feel empowered to constructively challenge potential bias where they identify it. They should have the freedom to challenge it. Chairs and secretaries in committees are alert to potential priming or groupthink, where it appears that committee members are being unduly influenced to adjust their scores or comments by other louder voices in the room. It's a common phenomenon. In such cases, it is the chair's role to ensure that the discussion is balanced and every member has an opportunity to be heard and influence the overall selection scores. Members do not pay undue attention to applicants' track records. While track records may play into panel decisions, it should not be emphasized to the extent that innovative and potentially high-impact work by less established researchers is disadvantaged. That applies to all workers in the university. So these are standard recommendations. How do we make this happen in the university system? How serious is Queen's University in ensuring that EDI is embedded into every action we undertake on behalf of the university? Because the university's reputation is crucial. Thank you very much.
¡Ay, bonita, qué bonita!